It's time to take enlightenment off the pedestal, friends. Enlightenment is a Western word. In the traditions that the concept of enlightenment, I would say, comes from, but rather it's actually, we've put it on to those traditions. The word that was used, far more literal translation, is awakening. Buddha means awakened one. But here's the thing. The Buddha didn't call himself Buddha. The Buddha called himself Tathagata, which means one who is thus, or one who is just this. One who is just what you see before you. One who is just moving his hand through the air. One who is just making noises with his mouth. One who is just this. And you, as you watch this video, are one who is just watching this video. Now, you may get distracted at some time. You may fabricate some kind of thought that you layer on top of what's going on, some kind of interpretation or judgment or label or description. And these things only obscure your thusness, your suchness. This is another fun word that's used in the English translations of some of these wisdom traditions. See, very often we have enlightenment or awakening backwards in our culture. In Western culture, we're so concerned with achievement that we've turned awakening into an achievement. But it is not an achievement. It is your true nature. That's what all the wisest teachers teach, is that awakening is a subtractive process, not an additive one. I had two great hypotheses that I had to test during my own journey of awakening. One hypothesis was, what happens if I attempt to cultivate good qualities, develop good qualities, like clarity, joy, peace, compassion? The other great hypothesis that I encountered later in my journey was the hypothesis of, what if joy and peace and clarity and compassion are my default mode, and that I was taught a bunch of stuff that obscures those natural good qualities? What if I was taught to worry? What if I was taught to hate on myself? What if I was taught to be distracted and to seek pleasure? And that actually all that had to occur was for me to unlearn all of those obscuring behaviors in order to realize I'm good. And you see, when I say it in these terms, it sounds casual, doesn't it, friend? And I'll tell you, it is casual. We read about these teachings in ancient language, and that makes them sound exotic. We read about them in language from other cultures, and of course that makes them sound exotic. But what the Buddha taught was the return to ordinariness. Wisdom is ordinariness. The difference between wisdom and knowledge is that wisdom is naturally occurring, whereas knowledge must be acquired. We spend so much time in Western culture worshipping at the altar of knowledge that culturally, until very recently, we really had forgotten what wisdom was. Our wisdom had been reduced to proverbs. I was seeking wisdom from the moment I came online as a little boy, but the best I could find of it was a bunch of rules in church. Now, this is not to say that wisdom is not available in the church. It is, but it's very hard to find. very difficult to find practical Christianity. It certainly was not available to me when I was young. Thus, I went on a 26-year search with these questions burning deep, deep inside me. And it wasn't until I then finally found a Buddhist teacher approaching the age of 30 that I felt I was getting some answers to these questions in very simple, practical terms. Questions like, who am I? Questions like, why am I here? Questions like, what is my purpose? And the truth is, these questions, as much as being answered, were really rather more dissolved. The question, who am I, for example, kind of falls apart in the process of self-examination that is so central to any effective practical wisdom teaching. We examine the condition of self. We examine the experience of being a person, of being an identity, of being someone. And when we examine it, we find it's not as solid as we were led to believe. I remember one pivotal meditation of mine. I'd been meditating for ages up until this point, waiting for a breakthrough. I'd heard wonderful things about this process of awakening, all kinds of stories of grand mystical experiences, and I really wanted that. And actually, the wanting that really got in the way. But during one very ordinary meditation, where my focus was rather more, let me just look, let me just see, what's really going on here? I remember I was sat in my little music teaching room down in my hometown, which is a place called Weston-super-Mare here in England. I was between students and I had some time, so I sat down and I meditated. I began with the typical breathing, and then I just examined. I just looked at what was going on. And at a certain point, there was very little going on. But then came an experience of myself, an experience of damnness. A mixture of sensation and feeling and mental tone that made up what I took to be me. And what was extraordinary about this experience was that I saw that it came. And if it came, I realized it must also go. And then I watched it kind of go and kind of come back again. And because I was examining it, it never quite went away. But I saw it kind of ebbing and flowing, flickering in and out, changing this experience. And then I realized that I had been making an assumption my entire life. I realized that this sense of myself was not always around. But I assumed that when it wasn't around, it was somehow ticking along in the back somewhere, waiting for me to check in on it. What actually was happening was what I took to be checking in on that sense of myself was actually the arising of that sense of myself. And that then, as I engaged in something else, of course that experience disappeared, was nowhere to be seen. And there was no way for me to confirm that it was indeed ticking along somewhere in the background. Now, this is a moment where it's important for me to make clear that in meditative practice, in contemplative practice, in this process of self-examination, we place great importance on direct experience. Direct experience meaning what's actually going on for you. So what I realized in that context was that my assumption that this sense of myself was ticking along in the back somewhere was, first of all, very vague. Where is the back? What does that even mean? Where is it? Do thoughts have a location? I mean, it opens up a whole other bunch of philosophical questions. But what I realized in the meditation was that actually it was nowhere. But I had assumed that it was. Again, this is in terms of direct experience. We can speculate endlessly about what may or may not be going on in the subconscious. I'm really not all that interested. In my direct experience, in that meditation, I saw my sense of myself come and go. Many people have reported experiences like this on psychedelics. The issue with that is you're on psychedelics. And so you can never quite be sure if the experience is due to, created by the drug, or whether it's, quote, genuine. Now, I'm not against the use of psychedelics, but I decided that in my self-examination, I wanted to be sober as a judge, so that I knew that there was nothing outside of myself confounding the data. So there I was in my workplace. I was indeed sober and had this experience of what is often called ego death. I saw the ego as a construct. I saw it come and I saw it go. And I saw that it was an assumption of mine that it was ever anywhere to be found when I wasn't actually having the direct experience of being myself. But also, I had lived my life as though I really was that impression of myself. And I also noticed during this meditation that that impression of myself was not a particularly kind one. Those feeling tones, those mental tones, those sensations that made up that damnness that I was experiencing had flavors of low self-esteem, lack of confidence, smallness, incapableness. Not sure if that's a word. There was very much a negative flavor. My opinion of myself, my sense of myself was not a great one, was not a flattering one. And so you can imagine this was liberating, because I saw this is just an assumption. It can't be who I am, because it's an experience that I'm having. So if it was who I really am, I would disappear when that experience itself disappeared, which it did. Who remained, then, in the absence of that experience of damnness? Or who remained was the real me. I would not have been able to articulate this to you at the time, friend, but what remained, who remained, was awareness. My practice was not yet so mature as for me to even know what I was looking for in terms of that true identity. But that was an early experience of that fundamental truth that awareness is the ground of being. Awareness is the common ingredient in all experience. And anything that we take to be a self, an identity, an I, a me, a mine, is just an experience that comes and goes. We are not who we think we are. We are not who we feel we are, because thoughts and feelings come and go. My hope is that sharing this story with you, you might be able to experience some relief yourself, to even consider for a second that who you think you are, who you feel you are, may not actually be who you are. If you have no experience in meditation, in these kinds of forms of self-inquiry, this may very well sound to you far-fetched, mysterious, esoteric. But I was a very skeptical practitioner. I was always looking at this stuff with a very critical eye. And this served me well because it meant that I had to confirm everything that I heard from one spiritual teacher or another in my direct experience. Something else I can tell you about this is that that experience of ego death was nothing like what I imagined when I heard the term ego death. And it was nothing like I imagined when I heard people tell stories of ego death. Naturally, this kind of an experience is going to be deeply personal, individual, intimate. At the same time, the true self that we glimpse, awareness, is common to all of us. But the mind is complex, at least when it's active. And so each of us is going to take a different route to these kinds of realizations, and it's going to be nuanced and subtle and complex. There is no one prescribed pathway through the mind, through these obscurations, to truth. I see this more and more. The more people I work with on this stuff, the more I see, especially now, given the vastness of information to which we have access. Everyone has had different kinds of encounters with different spiritual teachers, different wisdom texts, different practices. Perhaps they've worked with therapists. They've certainly all had unique, colourful experiences of life. And you've had yours. So please avoid the trap of thinking that your experience of this stuff must align with something that you read in a book or hear someone else report. It's just highly unlikely to be like that. You may experience some similarities. But in what could there be more variety than the human mind, the single most complex thing there is? So take a leaf from my book, learn from my experience, that the answer is always honest, careful, and thorough self-inquiry, exploration, investigation. Look, and look again to see how things are in your experience, not someone else's. I avoid telling anyone how this is going to be for them. descriptions of awakening that I heard in grand poetic language were hindering, if anything. Because I would hear one of those descriptions and I would go after it. I would want that in my experience. Well, then I'm into attempting to recreate an image of something that I've heard, and that's in completely the wrong direction. We're looking instead to strip everything away. If you can let it go, let it go. If it can be subtracted, subtract it. And look at what remains.